Oh my goodness, I have had the most crazy, hectic morning. So I was at my beach house on the coast of Maine. I was collecting clams in this bucket here, and then it hit me. I am supposed to get on a plane and get to Hanover, Ohio. I was supposed to be here. I barely got to the plane, and so I'm sorry if I'm a little frazzled. By the way, my name is Rachel Carson. There's how you spell my name, and I am here at your teacher's request. Your teacher requested I visit because I hear that you are about to become environmental detectives, that you're going to be solving two environmental mysteries. And I'm here because I am really our nation's first environmental detective. So I need to tell you a little bit first about my background, my childhood. So, gosh, I was born a long time ago. I was born in 1907 in a town called Springdale, Pennsylvania. And it's really not that much different than what I've seen from Hanover so far. And I lived on a farm, like a lot of you live on a farm. But I was living there in the midst of industrialization and industrial expansion. And let me tell you a little bit about my parents. My parents, their names were Robert and Maria. Oh yeah, I also had two brothers, but they were 8 and 10 years older. So in some ways I kind of felt like an only child. Now let me tell you about my relationship with my mom and how it really shaped what I would do for a career. My mom was a lover of nature. She was very nurturing, and she would take me on nature walks. Like many of you, we had farmland, but we also had part of our land that was forested. And so she taught me to identify trees by their leaves, to look at foot tracks and know what kind of creature made them. She gave me a deep appreciation for nature. You'll see how that'll play out in my career choice. My father, on the other hand, my father, I know he loved me. He didn't say it often. He was not very affectionate. He was very hardworking. But I do need to tell you about a story that I remember very clearly from my youth about my dad, and it really played a role in how I would be in my adulthood, in my career, in my dream to, or my work as an environmental detective. So coal mining in Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, it still is a big deal, but it was an incredibly big deal back in the early 1900s. And so the coal mining companies were certain that underneath our land there were veins of coal, very profitable veins of coal. And so they kept trying to get to our land and buy it. And they would come and they would offer Dad. He would say, no, this is a family farm. We're not going to sell our family farm. They'd offer more and more money. He still said no. Well, he found out that they were, now try to imagine this, digging down vertically off of our property, then coming under our property horizontally and mining the coal, stealing it. I have never seen my father so angry as I did that day. So here's what we have from my parents, right? My mom has made me a lover of nature, to have deep respect of nature. My dad, he really made me skeptical of big business, to doubt their sincerity, to doubt that they would be honest. So let me tell you a little bit about what subjects I loved in school. You might have guessed that I loved science first. That is actually not true. My first love was writing, and you'll see how that plays a role in my career. I was first published when I was only a child. How old was I? I believe I was 12 years old. My brothers at the time were in the Army with, World War I was going on, and I wrote a story about the war, and I don't mean to brag, but I've become wealthy off of my writing, but I don't think any royalty check that I've ever gotten from my writing gave me such a sense of pride as that first time seeing my name published, my work published. And maybe some of you are published authors and know what that feels like. So let's fast forward to to my college. So first of all, I went to college. Now let's think about this. It would have been the early to mid 1920s that I misspoke. Mid to late 1920s that I was in college. Do you think it was rare or common for a woman to go to college then? And I honestly was much more rare. I went to the Penn College for Women, which is now called Penn University, not Penn State, but Penn. It's actually an Ivy League school. And this will not shock you. I worked on the school newspaper because I loved writing. And then I also liked sports. So I was the goalie on the field hockey team, which is kind of similar to lacrosse. So I knew I wanted to be a writer, but then my sophomore year, my second year, I had a professor in biology, life science, and her name was Mary Scott Skinner. And you know what she told me? She said, Rachel, I think that you have a high aptitude for science, which means you pick it up really easily, you can catch the concepts. And so she thought I should double major. So not just in writing, but also major in biology. And those two things we don't normally think of going together, but I was so inspired by her, I followed her advice. And so I graduated from college with both of those degrees. Now, after that, let me get this right. Okay, so after that, I decided to go on to grad school, which would be, it's just been a while, people. It's hard to remember everything. I decided to go to grad school. And so the summer in between my, regular degree and grad school, I got a job. Now, this was my dream job. I wanted to see the ocean so bad. Just like Central Ohio, we were landlocked. And it wasn't as easy to travel back in the 1920s, right? Cars weren't as good as they are now. Flying was very, very rare. So I dreamed of the ocean. And I got a job at the ocean. And I'll tell you what I was doing. I was gutting fish the entire summer. And I loved it because I felt like my calling was somehow linked to the sea. Okay, so check out these pictures of me. Okay, so this is me in my younger years. So you can see there I'm working on the boat, and here I'm actually researching from the book that made me famous and wealthy. But let's get now to my career as both a writer and a biologist, right? These things that were kind of didn't seem connected. So the year was 1929 when I did this internship. That should stand out to you in U.S. history. The Great Depression started, right? The stock market crashed, and it led us through the 30s in this Great Depression. So it honestly worked out pretty well for me. You might know of a president, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. He came up with an economic plan called the New Deal, and it actually created a lot of government agencies. So I got a job at one of these government agencies, the Bureau of Wildlife and Fisheries, and I made $1,000 that year. That was my whole salary, but at that time, it was really, really a lot. And here's what I did. I did a radio show, and I discovered that I would write about biology. Now you might be like, a radio show, there was no TV yet. So people would gather around their radios and listen, and mine would have been almost like a modern day documentary. I would have been talking about wildlife on this radio show. So I wanted to be a marine biologist after this. So the year was 1936, and I applied at the Bureau of Fisheries. I had to take a test. I got the second highest score ever on this test, not the second highest for a woman, the second highest ever. So you can see that I'm a very qualified biologist. Now, let's fast forward. The year was 1941. That should stand out to you. Pearl Harbor was in December of that year. We entered into World War II. And so earlier in that year, I wrote a book. It was my first book, and it was called Under the Sea. And it was all about making the ocean come alive for people that wouldn't be with it or be near it. It was critically acclaimed. The critics loved it. They said it was excellent. Nobody bought it. Early 1941. Okay, so I tried again. I wrote a second book. And this book was a year later, 1942, and it was called The Sea Around Us. And it was based on discoveries that were made during World War II of the ocean. It was a bestseller. And the reason really was people were very interested because of the war and what was going on. So that book made me wealthy. I was able to go live my dream and buy my beach house that I still live in Maine. Okay, but this sounds kind of crazy. I started to get bored a little bit. Like, now I'm wealthy. I don't really have to write anymore because every time my book sells, I still get a profit from it. But I wanted to continue to write and work. And so this leads me to how I became an environmental detective. So right here, this would be in my older years, I might be wearing the same scarf. I'm doing my environmental detective work. And so here's what was going on. Maybe you've heard of this, crop dusting planes. So they were taking these planes and they were dusting the crops with this chemical. And the chemical was called DDT. And so this would be now in the 1950s. And this DDT was getting into every layer of the ecosystem. And so I researched it completely for a decade. And at the end of my research, I published a new book, and it was called Silent Spring. Now, Silent Spring is not called Silent Spring because like a water spring. It's Silent Spring as in the season. And I'd like to read you just the very beginning of my book so you get a sense of just how bad this chemical DDT was. Now, mind you, before me, nobody gave any thought to protecting our environment, okay? This is the beginning of my book. There was once a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. The town lay in the midst of a checkerboard of prosperous farms, fields of grains, hillsides with orchards, where in the spring white clouds of bloom drifted above green fields. In autumn, oak and maple and birch trees set up a blaze of color that flamed and flickered across the backdrop of pines. Foxes barked in the hills and deer silently crossed the fields, half hidden in the midst of fall mornings. Along the roads, flowers and ferns delighted the traveler's eye much of the year. Even in the winter, the roadsides were pretty. There were countless birds to feed on the berries and on the heads of dried weeds that were rising above the snow. The countryside was, in fact, famous for its abundance and variety of bird life. Birds that would migrate, pouring through in the spring and fall, people traveled great distances to observe them. Others came to fish the streams, which flowed clear and cold out of the hills and contained shady pools where trout lay. So it had been for many years. So far, how's the ecosystem seem, right? Seems healthy, vibrant. Now listen. Then a strange disease crept over the area, and everything began to change. Some evil spell had settled on the community. Mysterious sicknesses swept flocks of chickens. By the way, this is all true. The cattle and the sheep, they sickened and died. Everywhere was a shadow of death. The farmers spoke of much illness among their families. In the towns, the doctors had become more and more puzzled by new kinds of sickness among their human patients. There were several sudden and unexplained deaths, not only among adults, but even among children. There was a strange stillness. The birds, for example, where had they gone? Many people spoke of them, puzzled and disturbed. The feeding stations in the backyards were deserted. The few birds seen anywhere were sick. They trembled violently, and they could not fly. It was a spring without voices. On the mornings that were once full of a dawn of choruses of robins, doves, and jays, and other birds, there was now no sound. Only silence lay over the fields. On the farms, hens tried to reproduce, but no chicks hatched. The farmers complained that they were unable to raise any pigs. The litters were small, and the young only survived a few days. The apple trees were in bloom, but no bees were among the blossoms. There was no pollination, and there would be no fruit. The roadsides, once so attractive, were now lined with brown and withered vegetation as if swept by fire. These, too, were silent, deserted by all living things. Even the streams were now lifeless. Fishermen visited them, but all the fish had died. In the gutters, under the eaves, and between the shingles on the roofs, a white, grainy powder still showed in a few patches. Some weeks before, it had fallen like snow upon roofs and lawns, fields and streams. No witchcraft, no enemy action had silenced the rebirth of new life in the stricken world. The people had done it themselves. So, that was the intro to my book called Silent Spring. I went through then, chapter by chapter, very detailed, the chemistry of this pesticide DDT, how it was affecting the streams, the groundwater, the plant life. I figured out what was happening to all those birds. DDT messed with the eggshells, and so like the chicks couldn't hatch because the shell was compromised. And so at the end of this book, here's what I called for: a ban on DDT. So I published this book in 1962. Do you think that this wealthy pesticide company said, "Rachel, you're right. This is a dangerous chemical"? Oh no. So in the 1960s, there was black and white TV. I would go on these talk shows. It would be me, little Rachel Carson, And then on the other side, it would be men in suits, all men from this chemical company. And they had this gets me fired up to this day. They said this to me: Rachel, you are a woman. How could you know these things when I am a trained biologist and excellent writer? So here's the end of my story. Do you get that I was an environmental detective, right? The first one, right? Figuring out what was killing all of these creatures and causing these environmental issues before we had an environmental protection agency or an environmental movement. Well, now we are in the 60s. JFK, John F. Kennedy, was our president, and he read my book, and he had an independent commission verify my results, meaning like figure out that I was right. And he ended up getting DDT banned. And because of my work, there's now an environmental protection agency and environmental laws. I'm credited with starting the environmental movement in the United States. Now, what about me? I never saw in my lifetime DDT become banned. Tragically, I died in 1964 of cancer, and they're pretty sure that my cancer was caused because of all of my laboratory work that I did with DDT. And so my legacy, what has lived on though, is the start of the environmental movement. So I have come back from the grave, from my main beach house too, and I am so excited that you get to follow in my footsteps, that you get to solve not one but 2 environmental mysteries. It is such important work. Good luck to you.